The bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki ushered in a new era in human history. The atomic era. It turned out that it was possible to kill huge numbers of people easily and effortlessly, with minimal effort. The military machine of the two superpowers shuddered and immediately, even with pleasure, stepped into this new terrifying world. Now it seemed that everything could be nuclear. As for nuclear-powered submarines, the USSR was among the catching up. In 1954, the US launched the Nautilus, the world's first nuclear-powered submarine. But the Soviet Union was not going to give up. It was making a vehicle of its own, more advanced than the one made by its archenemy. As is often the case, not everything went according to plan. What's more, the first Soviet nuclear submarine symbolized one of the gravest tragedies in naval history. Catch up and surpass the Americans. The creator of the first Soviet nuclear submarine was called the Tupolev of shipbuilding. In the beginning of 1920, escaping from hunger in the Volga region, the very young Vladimir Peregyudov came to Petrograd, where he entered a naval engineering school. It so happened that he was among those who happened to work on the first Soviet submarines. Then the specialist served time in Stalin's camps, miraculously returned, and in 1952 he was summoned to the Kremlin. The task is difficult. Intelligence became aware of the development of a nuclear submarine in the United States, which meant that it had to be done better, if not faster. Peregyudov, who was over 50 by that time, agreed to supervise the project. Together with the team of designers and academicians, he did not leave the design office for days and nights. A great number of problems were to be solved, which he had never before had to deal with. How would a nuclear reactor behave underwater? How would the system's performance be affected by rocking and complex maneuvers? After all, what should a nuclear submarine even look like? Incredibly, in just over a year, most of the basic questions were answered. By the time the American Nautilus was launched, Peregyudov had designed a submarine that had nothing to do with the design from the United States. While the Nautilus actually replicated the shape of its diesel counterpart, the Soviet K-3 looked like a torpedo. The construction of the first nuclear-powered vessel of the Soviet Union started on September 24, 1955 in Severodvinsk. The project was secret, and only a few people knew what was being assembled in the docks. At the same time, the scale of construction was colossal. Practically the whole country was working on K-3. Steam turbine units were assembled in Leningrad, reactors were assembled in Gorky, extra strong steel was rolled out in Moscow, and the most capable sailors were selected from various parts of the USSR. Of course, everything was done in an emergency order. The fact that the Ministry of Medium Machine Building was responsible for the construction of the nuclear submarine is also important. The overwhelming majority of its staff had never seen the sea. Many things had to be remade literally on the fly. For example, the armament. Initially, the ministry decided that the submarine must be armed with a huge hydrogen torpedo 28 meters long and 5 meters in diameter. The assumption was that the submarine would reach its destination, release the torpedo, and quickly retreat. It was only when the specialists got down to business that it turned out that the nuclear submarine would stand on its, but when fired, it would be incredibly difficult to level it, but even if it succeeded, a giant air bubble would rise to the surface, which would give away the location of the vessel to the enemy. As a result, the design was changed, and the bow of the submarine had to be rebuilt, a process that took a year. But in the end, the K-3 was equipped with torpedoes of normal size. But this is only one example. All in all, during the design and construction of the object, more than 1,000 changes were made to its design. Nevertheless, soon the vessel was more or less ready. Hundreds of maximum radiation doses each. One of the most important issues on a nuclear submarine was crew safety. The health of the sailors was in fact protected only by a thin layer of metal that separated the two circuits, The first directly cooled the nuclear reactor, while the second was considered clean, and was responsible for the rotation of the steam turbines. The steam generators were constantly leaking and radioactive aerosols were appearing, literally poisoning the air around them. The dosimeters, according to the recollections of eyewitnesses, immediately went off the scale. At the time it was believed that the health of a sturdy man is not threatened by even 100 maximum permissible doses of radiation. The sailors in the 5th and 6th compartments next to the reactor had a particularly hard time. They got the worst of it. At some point the command decided to divide the radiation hazard equally among the crew. When the maximum permissible radiation dose was 100 times higher in the power compartments, we opened the bulkheads to other compartments throughout the boat and stirred up the radioactive air. Thus all crew members, helmsmen, torpedo men, commanders, and even the ship's cook received an equal dose as the managers and turbine operators. And only when 100 doses each received, we surfaced and ventilated the compartments into the atmosphere. Sometimes we even had to quickly supply the compartments with high-pressure air. And then we would dive again. Practically all the tests had to be conducted underwater. And so until the next time, recalled Lev Ziltsov, captain of K3. The situation was aggravated by endless revisions, improvements, and simple repairs. Because of numerous pipe re-weldings, the water from the first circuit turned out to be 3 to 4 orders of magnitude more radioactive than on the next generation submarines. Therefore, evaporation of even a single drip led to a sharp surge of radioactivity in almost all compartments of the vessel. Hollowed vessel at the North Pole. The first Soviet nuclear submarine was launched in spring 1957, in conditions of utmost secrecy. The hull was clad with plywood constructions, the sailcloth was thrown over it. Who knows what kind of beast lurks there? The boat tests and equipment tuning were done during more than a year. It took another year to further settle the formalities, and in March 1958 the K3 was officially introduced to the Soviet Navy. By the time its successors were launched, the firstborn had a lot of expectations, including marketing ones. At the same time, the K3 was completely unprepared for operation. In the first years, the submarine was in a state of permanent repair. All the steam generators were leaking, one of the 2 reactors was afraid to start, separate systems and mechanisms were failing everywhere. But the authorities were in a hurry. It was necessary to act, it was time to show it to Kuzkin's mother, and so on. At stake were shoulder straps, bonuses, villas in general, too much more valuable than someone's life. Then a special term was invented especially for K3 trial operation. This means that the submarine was kind of accepted for service, but the work on its improvement could be continued during the operation. That's how the submarine continued to be used. It went out to sea, broke down, somehow came back, was cut up, welded, and so on in a circle. In some parameters the Soviet design did manage to surpass its American competitor. Thus, if necessary, the K3 could reach a speed of 30 knots, while the Nautilus was 1.5 times slower. And in 1962 the nuclear-powered ship moved towards the North Pole. It was a kind of gift to the government. Nikita Khrushchev was going to visit the Murmansk region in the summer. The command of the Navy decided to celebrate the event with something unusual. In fact, the wrecked K3 was sent to the north. On the way the ship was repaired, and by some miracle it was still advancing under the ice. At one point the navigator noticed a sudden rise in the bottom topography. There was less and less water under the keel. It turned out that a real underwater ridge was discovered by accident. And on July 17th, at 6:50 a.m. the boat K3 reached the North Pole for the first time in the world. Khrushchev was satisfied. He gave out medals, orders and titles of heroes of the Soviet Union. The nuclear-powered ship, which soon broke down again, was renamed Leninsky Komsomol and towed to Severodvinsk. There, the plant cut out the entire reactor compartment, discarded it, and replaced it with a new one. The terrible tragedy was 5 years away. A penny spare part at the cost of 39 lives. The year 1967 was not much different for the Leninsky Komsomol from the submarine's entire past history. Breakdowns constantly haunted the machine. While on patrol in the Mediterranean Sea, one of the crew died suddenly. A ship had to be called in to transfer the body. After surfacing, the ship was declassified, which meant we had to return to base. It was about 2 o'clock in the morning on September 8, 1967, less than 2,000 miles to the base. Suddenly the alarm sounded. The central console received an alarm. The watchman flicked the tumbler, but all he heard in response was people screaming and terrible noise, as it turned out later raging flames. No one really knew what had happened. In the blink of an eye, the first and second compartments burned to the ground along with the 39 crew members. It was not until later in the investigation that a small gasket on one of the components of the hydraulic system was to blame. It was supposed to be made of copper, but during one of the countless repairs, someone had replaced it with a washer made of paranite, totally unadapted to pressure fluctuations. The gasket eventually leaked, the combustible liquid began to leak, and easily flammable vapors accumulated. A small spark and the first compartment burst into flames. Through the open bulkhead the flames burst into the second compartment. When the crew members on duty in the third compartment tried to investigate the situation and open the door, they too began to lose consciousness from the carbon monoxide. The bulkhead was slammed shut in time. During ignition, the hatch to the torpedo compartment was closed too. Otherwise the whole submarine would have been destroyed. Eventually the nuclear submarine surfaced. They started the diesel generators and ventilated the unaffected compartments for several hours. The submarine returned to base on its own within 4 days in the surface position with the first and second compartments tightly sealed. On the way to the museum, the incident was followed by a showdown. First, a specially formed commission called the crew members heroes. Then they were also blamed for the fire. A lighter was found in one of the rooms. Meanwhile K3 was cleaned, welded, repainted and staffed with a new crew. Service of the submarine continued for another quarter of a century, until the USSR died. In 1991, the vessel was taken out of the Navy, and wanted to be turned into a museum. But hard times came, and the Leninsky Komsomol was forgotten about for a long time. And when it was remembered, it turned out that the nuclear submarine rotted away and actually fell apart. A few years ago the remains of the submarine were about to be scrapped. This time, however, the Russian Defense Ministry found money. K3 was mothballed, the reactor compartment was replaced with an empty one and even launched. Today the ship is in a port in the Murmansk region, waiting for the next tranche of money to turn it into a floating museum. If you were interested, thank the author by giving me a nickname. And also don't forget to subscribe, so you won't miss even more interesting videos on my channel. Turn on notifications by clicking bell and share this clip with your friends. What else interesting you can add on this video? Write in the comments, it will be interesting to read.